All right, good evening. Saludos a todas, todos, todos. Bienvenidos a Tertuliando en Cuarentena. Esta noche, tonight, mainly going to be in English. As a Puerto Riqueño, I can't promise that a little bit of Spanglish won't come out, but it'll be for the majority of the tertulia. We're going to be speaking in English, and I'll invoke the liberty of speaking with the Spanish because our guest tonight also habla español, but we'll conduct this tertulia in English, and just like every other tertulia, I know it's a conversation, it's a continuing conversation that might not tie up topically with the others, but in essence and in substance, it does carry that same essence. So, without any further ado, let's bring aboard desde los New York, from New York City, José Humphreys. Saludos, greetings, my friend.
¿Qué tal? ¿Cómo estás?
Muy bien, gusto de tenerte acá. It's nice to finally see each other, even if it's kind of on the virtual end.
That's right. It's funny how we make friends nowadays, right?
It is, and this is actually quite magical too. If you really stop to think about it without taking for granted how crazy it is that within milliseconds we can
Uh-huh.
be transmutating ourselves via pixels.
That's right. That's right. And you're in Houston, I'm in New York City. Oh, and here we are together.
Claro, and I consider a pleasure, a privilege, and a feast. So, something I like to start things off here in Tertuliando, Jose,
Uh-huh.
is talking about the current context, right? Talking about the current context because one, it gives us a starting and mutual platform so we can see each other. And also because of how exceptional it is these times that we are, like exceptionally unique.
Mhm.
And I would like to know via this sort of like a three layered question, you
Okay.
know, to go back early this year,
Mm.
what were the routines, what things were you doing come early this year, January, February, then this phenomenon, the pandemia hits around March, changes drastically everything without our permission, as many things do. And how has it been since, these 7 months? Kind of, so what were you doing? This thing hits, running with it 7 months. And also, as the last part of the question,
Mhm.
what kind of assertions or conversation with yourself have you had in terms of reflections with what you have observed in terms of
Mhm.
society? What has the pandemic also brought to the
Wow.
surface at such a level it's hard to ignore. So what were you doing? Pandemia hits, running with it, and kind of like your observation in terms of society with pandemia.
Chacho, esa pregunta es como un sancocho, una mezcla
Para
de cosas.
empezar.
That's my style I eat, but that's good. When I look back at the pandemic, which hit the city back in March, and people suspected that it was actually here in January. But March was when there was this public announcement that the virus had officially arrived. And just on a plain basic personal level, I was planning to travel to Australia for the first time for a conference. I was going to be a keynote out there, and I was excited about going out there. First time doing that. My wife and I were also going to head out to New Orleans when we came back because I've never been there as well, and I enjoy jazz. And pandemic hits, then all of a sudden, um, I knew it was really serious when I got the call from the conference organizers just saying that they were going to cancel it, because Melbourne had been hit, and
Yeah.
that really uh, brought some perspective to things when you think about the pandemic and its global impact and global nature. Because I actually geeked out a little bit. I wanted to know, like, what is the farthest point from New York City? And ironically, when I did a Google search about the farthest city, the farthest part of the world from New York City, it's like Melbourne, Australia, where I
Yeah.
was going to. and they're telling me, stuff is going down here, and we don't think it'd be a good idea. Because I even thought about it. If they had not canceled it, if I would have gone, chances are I wouldn't have been able to return.
Yeah.
And so it was at that point we began to realize that this was more serious than the media had initially played it out to be, and it seemed on some level or another we were all impacted by it. And as you know, I pastor a church here in East Harlem, in El Barrio, and we had to make some really quick decisions about whether we would be still meeting together or we would be going online. Now, mind you, that very first Sunday, the beginning of March, we still hadn't received a lot of data about how contagious the virus actually was. So we had service, but we had, and I have a very detailed co-leader, co-pastor. We had hand sanitizer. We had created distance with the pews. We had instructions on like, hey, don't hug each other, just give an elbow bump or a fist bump, and this was before we had gotten all the information. So we did have one service between the inception of the pandemic, at least here and its public face, and when we received more news that people were actually dying of this, and it was highly contagious. And then that's when the week after, I forget the date, must have been like the third Sunday in March, we decided to go remote. And what hit me initially was how many Black and brown, mucha de nuestra gente en New York One, cuando se veía el noticiero, quién murió, quién fue infectado, quién, fueron los first responders that were hit as well. We just realized that, man, every face that we see on TV looks like me or you, Angel. You know what I'm saying? And people either dying, people either infected. And I began to realize that there was a disparity, not only in obviously in the level of care here, but it was many of the immigrant neighborhoods that were getting hit. It was becoming, in my estimation, and it's so obvious, I think at this point, a public health issue, a public health crisis, that this pandemic had basically exposed the healthcare system for what it was, its disparities. And we see that. And, if you look at the statistics now in New York, and, just a disparate amount of racial disparities, I should say, the racial disparities and how they break down people infected and also people who have died, mortalities, comorbidities, todo eso, we see that we have been disproportionately hit. And that to me was on some level not only sobering, but it was a traumatizing event for New York. If you could think, because if you think about it, we got hit really hard.
Yes.
And everyone else was kind of like just wait and see, or maybe it'll just stay in the city. And the Governor Cuomo the whole time is saying, well, listen, if it's happening here, it'll eventually reach out there. So don't sleep on it as well. So I think that those were the things. I think that's somewhat of the story arc. It was obviously a disruption in my own personal work schedule, but that, como se dice, those are first world problems. If that was the worst thing, you lose a little bit of income from not being able to travel and do a couple of conferences and all those things. I'm really grateful that, me and my family are in good health, and that, that I won't say that we've turned a corner in the city, but in many ways we have, because people are complying with wearing masks, and I think just doing what they need to do in cooperation with the government to keep the rates down, even though at this point, man, we might be looking at a second wave, and I'm hoping not.
Yeah, that seems to be happening in places in Europe where numbers were a little bit controlled, but now there is that second uprising. So like I for example, which I mentioned to you, that next term I'll be going back to Germany and communicating with some of my classmates and whatnot. Some of the ones that are regionally over there, they speak about the current present moment and the things they can do now, but very well aware of how these things could change the next day.
That's right.
some tighter measures could be made, and there's plenty of commentary that could be made into that regard if one wants to have an honest and genuine conversation.
Mm,
No una politiquería, but to have a genuine conversation about how
mhm.
effective is government, like government mandates and where they are headed in that direction. I have
Mm,
friends that have brought attention to, for example, to New Zealand as a good reference point, contrast to acá.
yeah,
Acá,
yeah.
acá es un poco diferente.
Necesitamos
Este,
más mujeres en liderazgo, a mí me parece también. Porque en
totally.
Alemania sucedió lo mismo también, ¿sabe? Eh, Prime Minister, who made uh, very sound decisions early on,
Yeah.
who's also a science person.
Yeah.
And I think what you see is those connections between people who actually honor facts, medical
Claro.
science.
Claro. And fact of the matter is that if we were to, I mean, speaking on the topic, if we were to compare with the current situation in the United States of America, the bar is really low. I mean, the bar is just ridiculously low. So that doesn't enlighten me. That doesn't make me feel like, I mean, yeah, one can make obviously the obvious case that, yeah, these other administration or governmental administrations are handling it significantly better. They could definitely handle it far better even then. You can even make that argument. But when you make the contrast with how things are here, it's the bar is very low.
Yeah. And also that the pandemic, in the most unfortunate of ways, has been politicized.
Claro,
And
as many things. Yeah.
who would have thought that a mask would be politicized, and that somehow, some way, that there would be a skepticism about masks, and that we would have this level of partisanship around abiding by the CDC's rules and recommendations.
Yeah.
It's really beyond me. And speaking also as a clergy person, what I observe out there is just that there's a tale of I used to say there's a tale of two Christianities happening out there, but to me it
Oh,
just seems like there's a tale of several Christianities out there.
yes,
And
plenty.
I've been having all kinds of debates with family members and also other church leaders, for that matter. And to me, what just gets to me is the height of irresponsibility at times in terms of what spaces they're creating for people. This is mostly outside of New York City, by the way,
Yeah.
where they want to insist on having worship without a mask, or masks are optional.
Yeah.
And to me, then it becomes a theological issue, because evangelicals, especially American evangelicals, love that analogy of, God cares about that one starfish on the beach, and that one soul is what matters. And then when it comes to COVID, somehow, some way, that theological understanding of the one
Goes out the
gets
window.
inverted. And it's like, what, if I don't wear a mask, what if one person even got infected and ended up on a ventilator? I mean, we can continue that same train of thought.
Yeah.
And somehow, some way, the argument collapses in reverse. And another popular meme I've seen is like, oh, I don't need a mask because I got Jesus. And I'm like, and then I think the meme says something like that. Yeah, but somehow you still feel like you need a gun to protect yourself. What happened to Jesus then?
Yeah.
So
The lagoon of contradictions is just infinite.
it's like cherry picking, man. And
Entirely.
how could a person's faith and theology hold any sort of substance and credibility when they think in those terms? It's just beyond me. I can't.
Mira, Jose, so I mean, clearly, I mean, I agree 100%. The level of idolatry. I mean, there's just that there, it is the revelation of idolatry, the continuous idolatry, the continuous gods and goddesses that are built based upon convenience, a convenient-driven gospel or an individualistic-driven gospel perpetuated by a status quo-driven God. I mean, so there, and that, there's going to be ins and outs throughout the dialogue about that. But I would like to give you a chance to share a little bit about your life, and if you could, to get to know you a little bit better and kind of a little bit through your journey, as much as we can within a limited conversation. But if you can share what you could reflect on are at least three experiences in your life that you deem them to be experiences of transformation, that whether lived out through an event of specific nature, whether through a season, but that you can allocate a reference to a moment, to the specificity or the generality of a moment, and that you can attribute the defining moment, like of this definitely. I mean, this, I think of this, and this definitely helped shape the person who I am. So if you can share three of those, and it'll give us a chance to kind of get to know you a little bit better and kind of a bit of your journey.
Sure. Gosh, where to start with that one? I guess I'll start with just maybe some of the early formative years. My family was from the Lower East Side of Manhattan. So my parents were from Puerto Rico, mi papá es de Mayagüez, mi mamá de Río Piedras, y llegaron aquí en los 50s. Y hicieron como muchos de los puertorriqueños, se mudaron al Lower East Side, Loisaida, como se llama. And that's my story. And that's where I was born and raised. And they converted to Pentecostalism when I was about 1 year old. And I think for me, when I think about formative memories of deep community, transformative community, the kind of community that in many ways, I just like think about scriptures now and I look back and it's like, wow, we were just like that tight-knit nomadic community that the scriptures in many ways shows in the image of Israel in some ways. So when I think about, going to church and then going to picnics and barbecues, and we go in these like green station wagons with the wooden panels. I don't know if you remember that, man, those old Chevy station wagons. I'm kind of repeating myself right now. And
I think of Chevy Chase.
Yeah, exactly. Los niños viajando sin cinturones, it's just like, seatbelts were optional and we're in the back there. And, somehow we made it by the grace of God to where we were going. But there was just a sense of this powerful community that I experienced early on. And I think that for me was a very formative thing that I've always taken with me, because I experienced it both in the church, but I also experienced it somehow in my hood, growing up in the Lower East Side housing projects. And, during the era of hip hop and breakdancing, and believe it or not, a lot of people don't know that Puerto Ricans had their hand in many elements of hip hop, from graffiti to DJing to breakdancing to emceeing to doing all of those things. And in many ways, tú sabes, cuando se miraba la experiencia del boricua y el afroamericano, se veía, tú sabes, una integración como de plátanos and collard greens, right? Or in our case, yuca. So there was just this amazing experience of just coming together around, parties, barbecues on the block, and playing all kinds of games of tag. And I think the reason that those memories were so informative and also formative for me is because many people often look at the simplicity of those experiences or look at what the housing projects were back in those days. Loisaida, that was the heroin capital of the world back in the 1980s. And I was living in the middle of that, with my family. And yet, it's like James Baldwin when he was living in Harlem and he saw, just everything from prostitution to drug dealing to murder and gang violence. He says that he still, in all of that brokenness, was still able to find something of the divine. And I found that. I still found something of the divine when I had Miss Brown, who was planting a garden, who would in some ways, cursed us out when we hit the ball and knocked out her heirloom tomatoes. But at the same time, we also knew that Ms. Brown was looking out for us.
Yeah.
And nobody can just go into our building, right, without speaking to the person who was in charge of the tenants association. And there was just this deep sense of community in the midst of concrete jungles, in the midst of stray bullets flying, in the midst of all of the things that I think we consider now, the hood. And I look back at that and just say, wow, I've never experienced that form of community since.
Yeah.
And a lot of my life, even thereafter, community in the hood and also community in my church. That a lot of my life, I almost felt like I was in some ways trying to reclaim that and trying to even produce that in churches that I've been a part of as a pastor. So I would say that those were some deeply formative experiences for me when I was like, younger, growing up. And when I look back at all of those stories, economic inequities, the school to prison pipeline that was going on right under our noses, gentrification, how that neighborhood that I just described changed. Now it's like a hipsterville. Now you wouldn't be able to recognize it. Exactly. Bodegas and bakeries got replaced by boutiques and bars. And so we see that there was some massive changes that had gone on there. And I was in many ways a product of that. So then like a third experience, if you will, then moving into East Harlem years later, which is where we started our church ministry, which is where we've been living for 20 years. A lot of the same dynamics that I saw happen in the Lower East Side of Manhattan are also happening in East Harlem. It's gentrification. It's the displacement of people who were native and indigenous, so to speak, to these lands, and also, just been here for decades, and were in many ways the cultural and ethnic memory and the identity that was held in this community. And so it's kind of awakened me to how to live mindfully in my hood in ways where I am consistently connecting with my neighbors, giving back, making sure that my church is thinking about shopping local, all of those things. Because East Harlem, and I think the common thread between in everything that I just described to you is that the places that we inhabit also have the power to change us and transform us. So it's not just happening in books, but it's also happening in how we move through the world, in our bodies, and connect with other souls and bodies in our neighborhood, simply by proximity, simply by incidental contact. Sometimes it's not intentional. Sometimes it's incidental. My son playing basketball, since we're kind of sheltering in place in some way still, we send him to the basketball court, and every day he's been doing that for months. By virtue of me just sitting on the park bench and just watching him, I have had the opportunity, and this is by default, I didn't know this was going to happen. He and I have now more neighbors and friends than we could have ever imagined. And it's been a powerful thing. It's like, oh, that's the same person again. Oh, the same people that walk their dogs. Oh, the same people that do the exercise. And it's allowed me to live in my neighborhood in a very mindful, connected, and intentional way. Simply, once again, just by being someone who was part of the hood. So I guess, I kind of wove a couple of experiences there from early on that in many ways have followed me into my, I guess, my present formation and my present situation as someone who's lived here for 20 years.
And I read a little bit. I read a little bit of in terms of continuity between those different experiences you shared, like a sense of visibility,
Mm-hmm.
a sense um, of could I say availabilizing oneself, like making oneself
Yeah.
available
Mm-hmm.
to what's going on, and regardless of perhaps you know how difficult it might be, or because you are invoking references to the memories of times that in some nature are no longer among us, but nevertheless are among you in the sense that they are a source of reference that you can not only go back as a nostalgic reference, but also go back as a as a real vivid alive bibliografia. Like you refer to it in
Yeah.
it's a breathing, living thing. But also, I think, I want to stop here to reflect on that, on the reflect on the changes of when we think about changes, and locating ourselves in New York, and the and geographically speaking, the different places where you grew up in, and you have observed these materialized changes, very tangible,
Mm-hmm.
throughout a number of years, that in perspective of history, it's nothing, but within our frame of life, they occupy a good amount of time.
Okay.
So how do you, you know in such a vivid city as New York, which is such a reference to the world for
Mm-hmm.
many things, for nothing more than its economic implication,
Yeah.
which kind of bleeds down and over pours into cultural, like
Mm-hmm.
everything that has to do with influencing that nature, but it all
Mm-hmm.
trickles down out of that economic power. Being there, and that serving as your hood,
Yes.
as your formative hood. What are your readings in terms of a city that can be very human and also very inhuman, um,
Yeah.
very humanizing and at the same time very dehumanizing. And this is a reading you can make of anywhere, but I mean, as a point of reference of how such amazing things have been born out of New York,
Yeah.
but also so many things that I think are things probably are not worth celebrating. And talk about gentrification,
Mm-hmm.
and what does that entail? To basically to sum up the question and make it a little bit more meaty.
Mm-hmm.
You know, talk talk about gentrification. What are your readings into gentrification, because they speak about a society that's changing, and also what are your readings into how do you manufacture perhaps hope in the
Mm.
midst of gentrification?
Yeah. Wow. It's so interesting that my perspectives on gentrification tend to vacillate between hope and I won't say despair, but hope and sobriety, right?
Mm-hmm.
And not that hope doesn't have a sobriety to it, because I think hope is actually grounded in reality and honesty, and takes a realistic assessment and then looks forward. I think uh, optimism is different. Optimism is almost like, I wish I can, I think I can, I hope it works out. So when I look at hope, in light of what I see with the story of gentrification, and I think we actually, maybe starting there, that gentrification is in many ways a story. It's an economic story. It's a story that deals with uh, integrating economies. That's the idea. That's the hope. Integrating economies that are whether it's a distressed, an economically distressed neighborhood, in hopes to draw in the middle class, in hopes to draw in um, a sense of stimulus for small business, to create some sort of vibrancy and maybe even introduce some different elements of culture where neighborhoods can then thrive. And now everything I just described might lead to have someone ask, well, what's wrong with that? That actually sounds pretty good. But the problem is that gentrification can often be like a machine, and can also be a another means of extending forth the colonial project. So here's what happens. You have neighborhoods that are indigenous. You have neighborhoods that have had history and culture already. You take a place like East Harlem, which has gone through uh, multiple migrations over the decades. Having folks who have migrated here from Europe and
Yeah.
from Puerto Rico, from now more recently Mexico, and so we've gone through different changes, and we see that there's also a richness of culture that everyone brings. People, different countries, different nationalities bring of themselves, and in many ways, East Harlem has been porous for being able to receive that and allow it to permeate it. An example of that is 116th Street here in East Harlem, where we see all of these amazing Mexican restaurants. And you have the different scents waffling in the air while you're walking through. And the sad thing is, like, my son is walking with me and he's like, Dad, let's go to Taco Bell. And I'm like, dude, really? You talking about Taco Bell? You have some real Mexican food right down the block and you talking about Taco Bell. And I think that snapshot that I just gave you is kind of a microcosm of what's happening too. It's that commodification, it's the big box development that ends up, instead of creating an integrationist element, what you have is that you find that capitalism, gentrification takes on more of a usurping element, and what ends up happening is it tends to make things more uniform, which in turn will strip the community of its indigenousness,
Yeah.
its story, right? All of a sudden, the institutions that we once knew begin to close because they can no longer afford the rent. People have to now move to Florida because they no longer can afford to live in New York City, or they'll move to the outer boroughs. And we see that it begins to really chip away at neighborhood identity. So that's when, because policies that undergird gentrification don't necessarily regulate these disparities. They're just like, let's introduce this new building and this
Yeah.
high-rise condo and this big business, not realizing that opening that big business has this ecological effect that will also knock the little guys out of business as well. So in terms of when I see that, it does make me not necessarily despair, but it does cause a deep amount of tension for me. And I think the hope can be that politicians can begin to think a little bit more creatively around how to develop neighborhoods in a way with an eye for preservation. And I've seen a little bit of that here in East Harlem.
And I guess
And I,
that is a more
yeah,
that has present a more ecological perspective, as it present a
yeah.
more sustainable type of perspective. And it brings me to my next question in regards
Mhm.
to um, your function as a pastor in the context you're in. I mean, we can't erase it. I think it was before we started. We talked about kind of like about our first world dilemmas and our first world reality, and it is a reality we live in. Kind of like it might explain a bit of why your kid wanted to go to Taco Bell. Like maybe he wanted that very specific flavor in his mouth. There's a little tad bit of legitimacy to him
Yeah,
wanting that, but at the same time, one can problematize it and see how ironic it is. That
yeah,
do you really want to go
yeah.
to Mexico, or do you want to go to this hyperbolized generic version of Mexico?
You want a
and
burger in a taco, or do you want,
sí, sí, totalmente, and it's complete valid to make those.
un pico de gallo?
What do you see as your role as a pastor? In in within what are the I guess what are the pastoral duties of someone in New York? What are the pastoral duties of someone in Harlem? What are people going to you for? What are your readings of and I'm sure some might have to do with everything we've been talking about thus far, but what is that context that you speak to, and what do you find your position as a pastor or your role as a pastor being relevant in that place? And I made the whole distinction of first world because of course we're not, it's not, you're not in another place, you're there. So the reality of being there, and also having perspective of other places, to not be so close, but also being realistically there where you're at.
Right.
Some perhaps anecdotal scenarios of, because I love hearing stories too. What are some anecdotal scenarios of what might be the everyday scenario for you as a pastor in
Yeah.
Harlem?
Well, I think one of the things that I learned is that the things that we do in particular places, so the particularities that we celebrate uh, can have this kind of universal application. In other words, the stuff that we're trying to do in our neighborhood in East Harlem, who knows? There might be someone in Sydney, Australia, experimenting with the same thing because they're realizing that there's some value to thinking very local. It's to your point. It's local, but it's global. it's not it's not in isolation, and it continues to remain in dialogue with the rest of the world around us. So New York City, as you know, is very transient. People are in and out all the time. Our church can sometimes be that way. So there are a couple of things that I think I approach. There's a couple of ways I approach this conversation with people, because people usually come to our church because they want to actually move through the world, specifically East Harlem world or New York City world. They want to move through the world in a way that's countercultural to a couple of things: the rush of the city,
Hmm.
countercultural to the the air of sophistication, right? That New York City tends to pride itself as being top of the line in several different industries.
Yeah.
And when people come to our church, like we've tried that big church, we've tried this other place, and it just seems to be simply just a mirror image of what's happening in the larger society.
Yeah.
And I think what we try to do is we try to cultivate um, a community where there's a sense of formation that tells a different story than the larger story that New York City is telling. And that means very concrete things. Like, what does it mean to slow down and love yourself and take care of yourself? Take some deep breaths, take a Sabbath, um, get off of the hamster wheel, and really just allow your spirituality and faith to be grounded, not so much in this idea of doing, but in being. We've heard the term before. We're not human doings, but we're human beings. I often repeat that a lot, and people find that refreshing. Uh, we also have an activistic spirit in our church as well that connects people's faith to the actual work that they're doing. So people, in some ways, when they're coming to our church, they feel like, hey, my career matters, and I can also locate God's activity in it. I don't necessarily have to be a church usher, a church deacon, but there's this amazing intersection that Pastor Jose is trying to weave between my industry, let's say in the arts. We do draw quite a few artists, or it might be in nonprofit human service professionals that were saying, hey, this is a space for you where you don't have to necessarily continue to just uh, run through the anxieties and the rush of society, but learn how to find God in your vocation. And I think that those are a couple of the simple ways that we really try to guide people through a formative kind of faith. One more piece with that, since it deals with gentrification, uh, shopping local for us is
Mm.
a state. Shopping local is a statement I make from the pulpit, and I tell you, hey, if Jeremiah in the Bible uh, heard spoke a word to the exiles um, about seeking the shalom of Babylon, right? For if uh, she prospers, you too will prosper. In many ways, if we get our churches to really think about what does it mean to actually seek out the well-being of neighborhoods, that here's the key, that I'm not moving into that neighborhood because it's up and coming. I'm not moving into those neighborhood, and a lot of times, we as Black and brown folks, there's a little bit of self-hatred. Like we feel like the neighborhood is better the more that white people move in. So
Yeah.
then it's like we'll say things like, the code words are, yeah, the neighborhood is up and coming, or yeah, it's we're maybe waiting certain elements out until the neighborhood changes. So my interest is to love and to seek the shalom, the peace of the neighborhood as it is right now. And that means shopping local, support the local bodega or the cafe or barchas, which is this fascinating integration and fusion of Tunisian food, right, North African food, and Dominican food. So the wife and the husband, Dominican, and he's from Tunisia, have created this
It's awesome.
amazing blend. And my wife and I actually, we go out on dates on Fridays when we drop off our son somewhere else. We go there and we get to support it, and that we have a budget for how much we spend as a household, at local restaurants, and as a church. We also make sure that we collaborate with other churches to make sure that we're looking out for small businesses. If you think about our context right now, Angel, small businesses are being decimated because of the pandemic, and now more than ever, we're seeing this ministry as very relevant because for us, uh, we all need to think about economics theologically as well. That our dollars are ways of our dollars ought to circulate in communities, so
Yeah.
that way the gift keeps moving.
And it's un tema apremiante. Like it's very um, poignant
Mm.
and important to talk about certain things that might come as second nature to some people, but to some people might come as very foreign. The
Mm-hmm.
idea that where you put your money, kind of like directly attached to um, it put your money where your mouth is kind of thing. Like in terms of where are we putting our buck? Where are we putting our buck? And our buck is also a representation of our time.
Yes.
When when I think of the I as a non-Christian, but very much involved in the Christian church for many years, and very much also recognizing the importance of the church to perpetuate the problem, or to really be agents of problematization and of really challenging. I recognize that because there's intrinsic community value there.
Mm-hmm.
But when I think of churches, I think of, and this is just something I've been thinking about lately, I think of charity.
Mm.
And I think lately I've been kind of having a little bit of a problematic relationship with charity, and definitely not from the angle of spoiling people, or that narrative, which tends to be a bit of a right leaning argument, but in terms of a bit of a perpetuation of the status quo, to especially when there's entities or organizations that could be funded by government. And as of late, with conversations I've had with friends and whatnot, and just studying situations, I see how deceiving sometimes charity could be, not as an excuse to not help people, but as a form of how it really just perpetuates poverty, and it perpetuates also the illusion that that they are not that they are not perpetuating poverty. Um, what are your readings into that, especially in a very, I mean, within the U.S., within New York, there's so much played into money, into what money means, and where you should put money into. How have you been, if you have, problematizing the
Mhm.
status quo in terms of that, in terms of charity? I mean, do you feed the hungry? Do you not feed the hungry? What does it mean to feed the hungry? You know, I guess that's the question I'm asking. What does it mean to feed the hungry if we are to follow that Christian narrative, or that historical Jesus? What does that mean to feed the hungry
Yeah,
in
that's
this
it.
system?
Yeah, it's a profound question with many layers because there's so many different ideologies that surround this conversation about economics and how we support, how we help people, um, how we might hurt them with charity. And I've heard the arguments, and there's a book out there about toxic charity,
Mm,
and how in some ways maybe churches, denominations, institutions have reinforced poverty by some of their approaches to giving. And I think so. It's a very broad conversation that I think has contextual implications. And I guess what I mean by that is just like it all depends on where you are and what the economic story is, because
mm-hmm.
economics is a story. First and foremost, I think when we look at economics, I think about like it's a Greek word, oikonomia, which means the rule of the household, and it deals and it implies stewardship. So at its base, when I think about economies and when I think about how we think about economy through scripture, it's stewarding. It's like,
Yeah,
what do we do with what we've been given? What
yeah,
have we started there? And I think that so there are times when I find myself vacillating on all parts of the discussion of the spectrum. So, for example, conservatives will say, well, it's about personal responsibility and people have to pull themselves up by their bootstraps.
yeah,
Well, but believe it or not, like I think that argument is taken to its extreme,
yeah,
right? And and yet I do also believe, and I remember when Barack Obama, a Democrat, who supports in some ways big government, had said, I hold intention to two different things. There's personal responsibility with the recognition that there are systemic inequities,
yeah,
and it's about holding those two things in tension. And the problem is that people often want to dichotomize them. They often want to
yes,
separate it and
either
oversimplify
or,
it, and then individualize it and make it about people's
yeah,
character. Like, what do you tell the person who is doing everything the right way and they live in Appalachia? They're working at Walmart and they're also waiting on tables by night. They're working like 16 hours a day and still making it barely above the poverty level. What do you
yeah,
tell a person then, that they're not working hard enough, that they're not taking personal responsibility? Obviously, there are systemic inequities that have created conditions for people to still lose, even when they have done everything that they were supposed to do. And so I think rather than answering the questions about, not in your situation, I'm saying in general, when people ask me about economics, I like to complexify it a little bit,
claro, claro, claro,
and then come back to it and say, okay, this is in many ways a contextual argument. I think there are times when I look at micro lending, for example, Angel, I think that's a wonderful thing, where you're giving grants out to entrepreneurs who are maybe in other countries, who are investing in their local businesses, and then they pay back the loan, and then it creates a sense of economic subsistence, and also hopefully more than that, it creates an ecology for thriving and success. But then there are countries where that might not work because you have uh, structural challenges in how government may try to impose its will and take that money and siphon it, and it's not a safe place to invest money in. And then you realize, like, oh, so maybe they do need charity. Maybe we need to like just give them the money and give it direct, and we can invest it in the same ways. And so I think the issue of economics and economic insecurity is complex. And what the church has done and what government has done as well on both sides, left and right, is that we've just created two different ideologies around it. Either it's toxic if we give too much of it, or people need to somehow pull themselves up by their bootstraps. But I think it's more complex than that. I'll give you one more quick thing. If you think about what happened after World War II, when veterans were coming out of war, 90+% of first-time home buyer loans went to white people, right? And they left the city and they bought their houses in Long Island. Meanwhile, black people who had served their country with distinction had applied for the same loans, applied for the same grants, and they were not given them. So now if you just think about that, how much of a head start is white America going to have in terms of having capital? Because when you buy a house, you now have what? Generational wealth that you can pass down to other children.
Yeah.
Think about 2008 when the bubble burst. And we had the whole, that's right, the depression. I think according to statistics, 50% of black wealth was decimated, right? Because of those variable loans, those balloon loans, and people lost houses, people lost property. But what did they lose? They also lost opportunities to be able to pass down capital to younger generations. And then, so we don't know those stories. We don't hear the history. So that what I would just want to say is we can't talk about economics without also considering the larger story arc of history and policies that have created certain stories of inequity in our present, if that makes sense.
You know, when thinking about economics and creating a space where we can healthily have this discussion in a sobering way or in a very factual way,
Mm-hmm.
I think about Puerto Rico
Mm-hmm.
and and the conversation about Puerto Rico and the conversation about colonialism. For example, I had a person here who I consider a friend now, Michael from Guam, and he was sharing a little bit about this situation in Guam. Um, I've been trying to become more knowledgeable in terms of the situation of that country, which is very similar to the
Mm-hmm.
situation of Puerto Rico, of its militaristic strategic placement in the geopolitical world, and how now it's really of no much use to the United States of America. You know, as a Puerto Riqueño born in the U.S., I wonder, what it's like, like what it's like for you, what maybe conversations you've been in place or a part of in terms of the Puerto Rican situation, like
Yeah.
what the hell is going on in Puerto Rico,
Yeah.
in so many levels. But
Yeah.
speaking about the fact that here we are at 2020,
Mm-hmm.
and what the hell is going on in Puerto Rico?
Oh my God.
Where, not to be overly idealistic, but where does one begin to have those conversations, and how do those conversations look, at least on an educative level, to
Yeah.
those who are just plain clueless? And I'm okay with that, because I'm okay with the fact that, yeah, at some point we're ignorant until we're not. Um, so
So
so what do those conversations look like? At least you on a personal level, maybe
yeah. Yeah.
share some reflections you've had about that, and what will that translate to, and because it's overwhelming like many other things, but how does one continue talking about it? How does one stop talking about it? If one, I mean,
Yeah, that's a great question. And you're right. There's a particularity to my perspective since I was born here, and I've traveled to and fro many times, and I have family members in Carolina, and my wife has family members in Barranquitas and Aguadilla, and so we hear all different types of like intel from the island itself, and I also realize that there's so much controversy in that, and I guess I would just start with my posture in that conversation. I realized that uh, I live this kind of between existence, right? I'm very American when I go over there. That's what they consider me very American. And then when we're over here, right, as people of color, living the brown afroboricua experience, that brings its own story of complexity as well. So when it comes to Puerto Rican politics and talking about how resources are allocated and how life is arranged through the politics there, I usually try to listen a lot more than what I talk. Because I find like sometimes I hear conversations about statehood, and there are times when those conversations actually seem somewhat appealing. There's times when I hear conversations about independence, and there are times when I find that, how would it feel not to? And I know everybody has different perspectives on this, and I honor those perspectives. But to me, sometimes when I hear the word Commonwealth, I don't really think Commonwealth. I think about the other C word. You know what I'm saying? And that's rough. So I think there's an impact to being in a situation like that where it would sometimes seem that the island is at the mercy of the policy wonks in Washington and even the Wall Street executives who lend out money and now places Puerto Rico in further debt. And then now, you hear about the president offering the stimulus package for Puerto Rico and offering all of these benefits and incentives. And what I think about is this: it's just like there's been an exodus of intellectual capital out of Puerto Rico. Many people have moved out to Florida and to the U.S. and I wonder what's to become of it. Does Puerto Rico in some ways experience, as it has, its own form of
gentrification?
I was going to say gentrification, but I was going to say hyper gentrification. Because this is not a neighborhood; it's an island.
It's a whole country.
And all the properties that people are leaving behind get bought out, and we go back to the island, and it's like this no longer has the character and the signature of what it is to be a Boricua. You know what I'm saying? Boricua de verdad. And the beautiful history that comes with it, right? From the beauty of culture in Loíza, where Bomba and Plena came out, and the resistance of Lares and those stories that have been told, and Plena and Ponce and the rich traditions of storytelling and folklore, and when I just think about those things, I'm actually proud of my history, right? That's a part of my history and my story, my parents' history and story. But I feel that not a sense of helplessness or hopelessness, but I would like Angel to kind of, and maybe this is a question for you, is like, I know that there are young people that are mobilizing. Around things that matter, around the economy, around calling for more accountability and transparency from the government itself. What do you see like as a if there was a place that people could hang their activistic hats on? If there's 2 or 3 places, where would it be? Is it with the young people? Are they the ones that are bringing a sense of hope and a sense of inspiration that maybe we're just not going to take what we're being given just lying down. What do you see? What are your
Well,
conversations?
I think I see the reference of, for example, after El Huracán Maria. I
Mm-hmm.
think after Huracán Maria, I think it's and I wasn't there. I was in southern Germany at the time.
Mm.
And I guess everyone in the diaspora suffered it in a very different way,
Right.
but nonetheless suffered it. You know, that helplessness of not knowing, that not knowingness. But Huracán Maria is a reference point because I think it shows the gross and flagrant ineptitude of the government.
Mm-hmm.
At the same time, it shows the complete aptitude and this sense of urgency that people found
Yeah.
to make stuff happen,
Mm.
to 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 totally forget this whole dynamic and myth of partisanship or bipartisanship. What the hell does that even mean when you have no electricity, when your house is just completely exposed, and there's such an empath that is being built in that, and the
Mm.
stories I hear from friends, from people I don't know, are continuous in that sort of nature. Another reference point is the summer of last year,
Mm.
summer of 2019. I had never in my whole life, and I was not there either, but looking at it from afar, and for those who don't know, it was basically the 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 toppling down of a corrupt governor, or at
That's
least
right.
the representation of corruption through the governor,
Mm.
and how it looked like for a whole people to massively, like never ever seen in Puerto Rico, hit the streets and
Right.
and seeing the effects and flirting with the effects of what it might look like to create a new world. Now,
Yeah.
there is a sense of bitter sweetness in there because you see you see how glorified that looked, but also how ephemeral it turned out. Like how
Mm.
I, at least maybe
Mm.
I was a bit ambitious, but I'm like, this is it. And
Yeah.
then, no, that's enough. We done. And I understand a little bit of that,
Mm-hmm.
not necessarily to justify, but I understand. But then then to go on social media and then read people's comments of like, let's give this person a shot.
Oh,
Let's give
yes.
this new guy a shot. And then you see how there were a lot of things. There's a lot you can read into what happened in the summer of 19, and a lot had to do with the chat that came out, and the specificities of the emotional aspects of how people feel offended,
Mm-hmm.
but also the fact that gross, flagrant, just explicit
Mm.
exhibition of what corruption looks like, of things that we knew, but to look at it face to face,
Yeah.
but to also realize that there's violence in that emotional, I feel disrespected, but
Mm.
to maybe there's also a reading of the not seeing the violence that is so intrinsic in the system that is
That's
also
right.
exhibited in the chat,
Mm.
that I think explains a little bit of how it outran its life.
Yeah.
I have
Yeah.
friends that are investing. I have friends that are, like I had a friend that was gearing up to open up a coffee shop, and then
Mm.
Maria hit. And then what do?
Wow.
He had a little table in front of what was going to be his shop, and he was just selling coffee by himself. And that drew a story in and of itself. And now he does have this pretty successful shop.
Oh, nice.
And there's duplicated stories like
Mm-hmm.
that.
Mm-hmm.
And for me, at least, in a sense of envisioning of where I
Mm.
want to be, is there. I mean, I am on my way to go to Europe and get prepared, but I don't see myself growing roots there. Maybe establishing and growing there, but my aspirations, I always see them flourishing in Puerto Rico.
Mm.
My projects,
Mm.
I always see them flourishing in Puerto Rico. The educational proposals I see them flourishing in Puerto
That's
Rico, not
excellent.
here in the U.S., here in Puerto
Oh,
Rico. So that's something I think I aspire not to not hold the government accountable, and maybe it's a little bit of my anarchistic ideology, but I feel like we don't have to ask the government permission for anything. We have to grab ourselves by that sense of bootstraps
Yeah.
and do
Yeah.
something and not wait for them, always
That's,
holding them accountable
mm-hmm.
because they have to answer, especially with all the money they have that is being
Mm-hmm.
invested in tax and stuff. So I do definitely have a little bit of echoing a little bit of Cornel West of, a little bit of a prisoner of hope.
Mm-hmm.
But there's a lot of lament that goes on
Mm-hmm.
in that process as well for me.
Wow. Well, there was a lot of hope in that, and actually, I feel inspired by what you said, because I almost got a vision of what happens if there were an exponential amount of angeles who
Or Abner's, like my friend who did the coffee shop. Yeah.
that's right, who went back to the island and brought back all kinds of capital, right?
Yeah.
Social capital, intellectual capital, um, invested in neighborhood
And
capital.
there's people and there's and there's many of them have been through this space, and as
Mm-hmm.
we start unfolding this dialogue, I want to kind of give a little bit of attention to them. There's many of people that have been in this space, and I remember I had some people come to me like, this is such a great project you have. You can go a little bit more Anglo and reach. And I'm like, no, I want to I want to make a space that, of course, and I have people here of all. I mean, I've had people here from Iceland, from Brazil. I want to have
Love it.
conversations with as many people as I can, but
Mm-hmm.
I also want to speak. There's this big space that I hold here for my Puerto Rican people, both to hear but also to participate. And I've had amazing people, professors, people in the academia, people in the service world, people in the fashion world. I've had that are from Puerto Rico and that are in some way one or another, you know, gestorando, like gesturing into
Mm-hmm.
bringing activity
Yes.
of intellectual,
Mm-hmm.
academic, economic value
Mm-hmm.
in Puerto Rico. And I think that there is, I mean, I'm preaching to the choir here, that there is plenty of potential, plenty of agriculture to be
Mm-hmm.
metaphorically and very literally to
That's right.
be harvested in Puerto Rico.
Mm-hmm.
And to close things off in that nature of, I see a little of a reference of utopias, and I think of Eduardo Galeano
Mm-hmm.
from Uruguay, and I
Mm-hmm.
think of his sharing of seeing the utopia in the horizon, and
Mm-hmm.
what is the point of the utopia as we walk towards it? You take 5 steps towards it, and it takes 5 more steps, and you take 5 more steps, and it takes 5 more steps, and you just see this futile or seemingly futile effort because of perhaps responding to that mythological construction that we need to touch, we need to grab the trophy, we need to
Right.
finally have serve a purpose. But
Mm-hmm.
then here we are, then invited to a reflection of what about if it's there to allow us to keep on moving forward, to
Mm.
keep on moving, to keep on savoring the process,
That's
not to
right.
hold a trophy. The
Mm-hmm.
trophy is the process itself. So a question for you to finish this
Mm-hmm.
dialogue, Jose,
Mm-hmm.
is what are your utopias that serve as a reference point for you in the horizon in such shitty times as we live in,
Yeah.
to still wake up, to still strive for more, to lament, to cry, to mourn, but
Mm-hmm.
to also keep on going, embracing all these things which are a very active part of the journey. So what are those utopias that allow you to keep on kind of pressing forward, pressing
Yeah.
on, as Bob Dylan said?
And I couldn't help but think about the late Octavia Butler, who was a African American woman. She was also a science fiction writer, and one of the things that she writes in one of her chapters is called the Book of Martha. And she says the Book of Martha was her utopia story. And she says, I don't like writing about utopia stories too much because my utopia can become someone else's hell.
Mm,
So,
I like that.
and that's what happens. Sometimes it's intentional, and sometimes it's not. For every policy that government creates, it creates a whole bunch of other problems at times. My wife is a policy major, and she always talks about that, the unintended consequences of policy. but does it mean we don't continue to seek that utopia or that on earth as it is in heaven, so to speak? Absolutely. We continue to strive and to grow and to cultivate the grounds for that. I think for me, the parts that it, I think invite me and excite me the most are the opportunity to create, like what Adam Maria Isasi Diaz, mujerista theologian, talks about, is these bigger tables, and so that we can develop a collaborative kind of spirit. And the bigger tables ask who's included, who's not. So as we move forward, not perfectly, but to the degree that we can, let's continue to build together and bring in together intellectual capital, social capital. So let's go on a healing path together, and more in more detail what that actually looks like for me in flesh and bone is. For me, I've dedicated a good portion of my life now to working with the criminal justice system, and with returning citizens, with youth that have been at justice involved, and my work specifically is around trauma work, trauma and healing and resilience. So, what are ways that we can cultivate spaces, hold spaces that are brave spaces, healthy spaces, healing spaces for people to find and reclaim their wholeness and their humanity, so that then they can go out into the world and invite other people, and for them to become whole and look for different ways to cultivate that kind of community. So seeing folks, for example, the Exodus Transitional Community is run by a Boricua, by the way. He's the founder. Julio Medina did 12 years in Sing Sing. He founded this organization 20 years ago. And it went from a staff of 5 people in a townhouse to now a staff of over 100 at multiple locations outside of New York. So those things that when it's so interesting that you talk about utopia. I go into Exodus Transitional Community, and I find such a sense of joy. When Black people talk about joy, they talk about Black joy. But when I think about brown folks, folks who are from the Caribbean or from Latin America, there's also that concomitant joy. There's the whether we want to call it joy or fiesta or celebración or whatever it is, there's a sense of the exuberant in our familismo, our coming together, our fraternidad. And I think that's the energy that I feel. And it's so funny to come full circle, right? The things that I talked about with you about my early hood experience.
Yeah.
Like feeling the sense of community, feeling the sense of confraternidad. I feel that when I go into Exodus and people share with me their stories of resilience and hope. And to see people transforming their lives and turning their stories around and then becoming advocates against a bigger system that over incarcerates, that dehumanizes, that racially profiles, that locks people up, to see them advocate for and against that and be about seeking for human dignity and transformation, I think is just a powerful story for me. So that's, I think if you were to ask me, like, what is like one of those rays of hope, it's doing my work right now in that organization, where it's mostly people that look like me and you, and we get to really see what hope looks like incarnate. So I'm really grateful for that. When I look ahead, I think my hope is that we will be thinking about bringing hope and light and utopia, to your point, in much more creative ways than we have in the past. Not to try to go back to the way things were. I don't think there's going to be a normal. There's going to be a new normal, and I'm still trying to discern what that's going to look like, Ángel.
José, gracias por este tiempo. Me lo he disfrutado bastante.
Gracias a ti.
Te deseo mucho éxito, ¿no? Y tengo una relación bastante rara con la palabra éxito, pero te deseo mucho éxito en el sentido, ¿no? Holístico, sostenible,
Sí.
Y hago esta despedida en español porque quiero como que acalorarla un poquito.
Sí.
Am,
Recibo
este,
esa palabra y esa bendición en este momento.
y entonces, muchas gracias y continúa, vaya, en ese peregrinaje. Ya te estaré también hablando yo, porque de algunas cosas que comentaste, yo creo que quizás podamos ayudarnos mutuamente, o quizás tú un poquito más que yo a ti. Y
No,
entonces
es mutuo.
ahí estrechamos los brazos. Y también a las personas que estuvieron, everyone who was here, I thank you for being. Kind of like a little bit of a reference to what you were saying, before, the idea of being rather than doing,
Mm,
de ser rather de hacer.
mhm.
So hopefully we can tap into that. Y si nos ven de forma grabada, if you see us in recorded fashion, then I hope you enjoy this and comment if you feel like. Y siempre cierro con esto, José.
Sí, sí.
Siempre cierro con las palabras de Walter Mercado. Con
Ajá,
nuestro Walter Mercado, figura indudablemente boricua,
sí,
que
sí,
tanto me disfruté el documental que tiene en Netflix. No sé si lo has podido ver, el
sí, sí.
documental de Netflix.
Powerful.
Exquisito. Y gente, hermano, es que lo necesitamos mucho. Necesitamos que tengamos mucha paz, pero sobre todo mucho, mucho amor. So, vayamos en esa búsqueda, vayamos ofreciéndonos esa paz y ese amor hacia nuestro prójimo. So, nos vemos a la próxima. See you guys around. See you tomorrow. No te desconectes todavía, José. Paz, gente. Nos vemos.
Bendiciones.